relay a lot of comments that I got from people over lunch about how good this auditorium is, which I think a lot of people would appreciate. And I'd like to thank the New South Wales Teachers Federation for supplying this auditorium to the AIA at 1/10 the usual cost, on the basis of good for them. Much appreciated, because the nature of the topic and the fact that it was free for our members resonated with them as a union organisation. Now, most importantly, we had someone to open the first session. I now have someone equally important to open the second session. Trapped in Melbourne and not able to get here earlier on was Julia Cambage, who is the CEO of the AIA, and this forms a very important part of the policy, and Julia will explain where this sits and how it is an important part of what the Institute's doing. Julia.
Thanks so much, and I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, being trapped in Melbourne, as you probably all know, coming from New South Wales, is a terrible thing. I wanted to start by thanking all of our speakers for their incredible generosity in being here and adding to this amazing piece of leadership that's being demonstrated by the Institute. When we came back on the 6th of January, people were desperate. Our members were reaching out to us. They were troubled. They were traumatised. I think our whole nation was traumatised by what they were seeing unfold on the TV, in the papers, on the radio. There was hysteria, and people wanted something to do. They needed some hope. They needed someone to show them the way. Interestingly, while that was happening, a young graduate called Yuri Lev set up a site called Architects Assist. He did that because he also felt very deeply about what he was watching unfold. And in his previous life, before graduating in architecture, he was a web developer. So he had these incredible skills to be able to put together a site really quickly that became Architects Assist. On the first day, we reached out to Yuri because we were actually looking at something similar. There was no point in duplicating the great work that he'd already done. So we set about supporting this young man to actually ensure that Architects Assist not only was a week-long project, but it became something that would last forever. Over the last few weeks with him, what we did was we set about building functionality into that would enable local communities to actually reach out to their local architects, for government at all levels to be able to reach out to professionals in their environment and actually draw them into the conversation. We also brought together all the staff around the country at a senior level in the Institute, and we talked to them about what we could do. And we actually tasked our state managers and executive directors, and obviously Kate, the fantastic Kate, joined in from an educational perspective in how we could actually support our members. We knew as an organisation that we needed to provide leadership for the built environment. That's what we do. That's who we are. We wanted to demonstrate those values very clearly. So we were very quick to come out with statements of leadership and direction for the built environment on how they could actually cope with what was in front of them. Our first step was to offer all of our CPD and anything that we possibly had for free of charge to all of our members and to others who were in the built environment, others who may be in those environments that were being devastated, and literally anyone who was interested. We did radio, we did television, we did newspaper print, we talked to everyone. We've communicated with every council in Australia that's actually been devastated. We've actually spoken to the mayors and the general managers. I was in Canberra this week meeting with members of Parliament whose areas have been devastated, talking to the Bushfire Recovery Agency, speaking to ministers from the built environment and those in housing as well, to actually demonstrate to them the value not only of architects and architecture, but of a broader urban planning and design feature that comes with the professionals that I work with. The great thing that happened out of our first meeting with our EDs is this event. They came together, they designed a program that would be offered across the country on our website for free after this has been hopefully cut and polished, and it'll be available for everyone. And we set about finding the most incredible specialists to be able to add value to that commentary as well. And so these are our fabulous volunteers who've given their time to actually assist you to be able to build back better, and I thank you very much. So the next steps for us are about how we actually engage in that community rebuild. It's still too early for a lot of communities to actually engage in that. In the next month, we're putting together another program to help you in how to actually have those conversations with people in areas that have been devastated. And it'll be around resilience and working with people who've experienced trauma. These are not necessarily the soft kind of skills that architects are familiar with. But I can tell you, our experience tells us that when you get to those communities, people will need to talk. And so the skill of listening and then being able to compartmentalise that and not carry it with you is going to be important. So we want to make sure that you've got those skills, because this is not going to be easy. Some of this will go on for years, and some places won't be rebuilt at all. But these are also some of the hard conversations that we need to have as leaders of the built environment, to be able to advise government, state, federal and local, that this place is not safe and that they need to not allow that area to be rebuilt. The other thing that will happen is that local government in a lot of areas have just lost 70% of their rate base. In order for them to be able to build back community buildings is going to be difficult and complex. They haven't got the money to do it. So how does that happen? We know that this is a long-term process. We're with you for that long-term process. We will continue to actually support our professionals to actually be able to work within this the new normal, and hopefully we'll provide you with all the skills that you need to be able to do that. I thank my team. It's been an incredible couple of months, tough, and they've been fantastic, and they've come up with some really fantastic events, and we'll continue to do this. Some of the things that you'll see in the coming months will be some design competition around building design. So we've actually got designs that we can make available for home building. We're also looking at community resilience and actually master planning. So there'll be a whole range of different opportunities and engagement activities that we will do. If you're looking to get your hands dirty at the moment, I would encourage you to look at Blaze Aid. There's a lot of stock out there wandering without fences. And if you want to arrange anything at this point in time to help any communities, I would direct you towards Blaze Aid. On a final note, we set up something called Architects Donate. We know that there's going to be a whole range of people out there who are some of our most vulnerable, who are either underinsured or not insured. We would like to be able to have the opportunity through our foundation to actually not only provide them with a fantastic design built to the highest ratings and be able to be used as a showpiece, but also to fund the construction. So working with people like the MBA to actually do that. And the other thing that you might be wondering about is, are there people out there who are going to be able to build back, given the loss that we've had, not only in infrastructure but also in housing? Is the stock going to be replaced? We know that we have enough trades across the country in most areas. The only area that's experiencing a shortage at the moment that's been identified through the Insurance Council is Gippsland. So basically, the skills are out there. We're great at what we do. Let's continue to lead and support our other partners, such as AILA, PIA, Engineers Australia, and I think together that we can actually make sure that Australia's built back better. Thanks. I'll call on the next speaker.
Thanks, Julia. We have a couple of things for this afternoon session. The first thing is to talk about ignition points, the dangerous parts of the building, and to do that is the speaker from this morning, Douglas Brown. Won't make a reintroduction again, but what I will say is that Douglas mentioned that he writes for The Conversation, and I think it's important that we all go and find good information, and I think good information is not necessarily what turns up on Instagram and Facebook, but it might be better there. And some of the things that he's written about, including how can we build houses that better withstand bushfires, where to take refuge in a home in a bushfire, how bushfires destroy homes, and 12 simple ways to reduce bushfire risk. That's all on the Conversation website, which is a great source of work written by academics. Could you please welcome again Douglas Brown?
Well, now I know how to use the clicker, so I feel pretty good. So let's start off by just a bit of very quick revision about the conditions necessary for a bushfire. So, high temperature, low humidity, high wind speed, high fuel load, and then ignition. So if you don't have ignition, you don't have a bushfire. If you don't have high wind speeds, you simply have another hot, dry day. It's when you have a hot, dry day with high wind speeds and this ignition that we have a bushfire. And that's the difficulty of this space, because you can have so many days where the conditions are right, but we don't have ignition. Now, bushfire research, and this has followed, approximately 70 years of research. So after major bushfires, there are post-burn evaluations, and as part of those, you look at the damage to structures. And so over a period of time, over the 70 years, we have found out which are the weak parts of a building that repeatedly occur. We've had some false alarms. One false alarm, which was kind of amusing for a decade, was that if a structure is white, it will not be it will not be attacked by a bushfire. Okay, and that's because white reflects heat. So that one did in fact last for 10 years, but we've got 22 really good outcomes in terms of identifying the repeated weak parts of a structure, and we refer to these as building ignition points. So let's have a look at bushfire research. So this research has been done here by the scientific community, and essentially they've come up and said these are the weak points, and what we're going to do is we're going to change the construction of buildings, and we're going to look at those weak points and strengthen them so that the building as a whole has a greater ability to withstand a bushfire. But architects and our profession have not been absent in this field, but our methodology is different. So what the scientific community does, it does a study, it then does a scientific paper on that study looking at the results from this bushfire evaluation, and then it compares those with previous evaluations. That's not the methodology we use in architecture, unfortunately. But we have done a few things. So after the Ash Wednesday bushfires, Boral had a competition. Because the fires affected Victoria and also South Australia, they had a $10,000 prize to come up with designs. And then that was followed after the 2009 Black Saturday fires. Our own institute, the Victorian chapter in association with the Victorian government, came up with a competition, but you only had like 2 months to come up with a design and there was no prize. And that's a very unfair expectation to ask of architects. There are a couple of other articles that architects have produced, but generally what happens is we have some really creative architects. They come up with innovations, but they're not necessarily published. And so we need to find a way to pull that information together. So, we focused on the scientific methodology, and sometimes that's at odds with the design. Design is expressed differently to the way that we reflect science. So I'm going to make a bit of a controversial statement here, which is that most construction materials can be used in bushfire-prone areas, but we have to differentiate now between those materials, whether they're used externally or internally. So let me give you an example. I'm going to pick one building material and talk about that in a bit of greater depth. And that one's timber. So let's have a look at timber. So 8 to 9 of the 22 building ignition points result from the use of timber. You can see what they are here. So timber window and door frames and timber doors are actually part of the structure of the building, but then we have these other components which are either right next to the building or close to it, and all of them create damage. I'm actually going to go through and show you lots of photographs a bit later on, but I just wanted to look at the timber example. So if we're finding that timber has this effect externally, here are some of the damaged timber elements. So you've got this, you've got decking and pergolas and stairs. One of the things about a bushfire is the natural gravity that you'd expect doesn't happen because you've got the high wind speed. Embers get blown up into really high areas. So this area here, this post would be 2 metres high. Embers have lodged in that, and there has been someone to put that spot fire out, otherwise the whole thing would have gone up. We can look at a low maintenance alternative. That goes back to what I said before. If we're designing a structure for 50 years in a bushfire-prone area, we will try to look at low maintenance materials. But I'll just go back on that. I don't want to say don't use timber, because timber is a sustainable, renewable resource. It's also a carbon store, and in the right setting, a thing of enormous beauty. So if we're not going to use it externally, we can use it internally. So you can see some examples here. On this, the fire one here, they've got the window frames are made of timber. Well, we wouldn't do that now, but you can see the use of timber internally is aesthetic and it's effective. Now, some of the structures that you will be redesigning, those people have not just lost their homes, they've lost the contents of their homes. And so what you can do now is to build in furniture. So you can have built-ins, and that way you're using timber and you're also saving them from having to purchase internal furnishings. And the use of built-ins is really useful in terms of creating space. Let's have a look at the roof cavity. The roof cavity is one of the most problematic bushfire ignition points. And it's problematic for two main reasons. It's difficult to extinguish. So if it's a double-storey structure, you have to get the fire hose into the roof cavity, and the roof cavity normally doesn't have a window. So it's difficult to actually get the fire hose into there to put the fire out. And also when you do that, when you extinguish the flames, you damage your structure, you damage the electrics, you damage the plasterwork, you damage the furniture. And that's a little bit counterproductive. You're trying to put out fire, but you're damaging the structure at the same time. So let's have a look at some of the things that we can do in terms of that. So one of them would be to extend the eaves and collect the rainwater at the ground level. Another would be a hybrid solution where you still extend the eaves, but you might have gutters on a couple of the elevations, on a couple of the sides, directly attached to water tanks. Another one is to have all components constructed of metal. And finally, the one that I'm kind of thinking about now, the big danger of embers getting into the roof cavity is that if residents are taking refuge in a particular part of the house, that part of the house becomes vulnerable if the roof cavity goes up, because embers spread right throughout, potentially throughout the whole house, and the whole structure is potentially compromised. So initially what would happen is smoke would be affecting those people in the room, and it would come through the gap between the ceiling and the roof, would just come as smoke, which is potentially toxic, and then later it would develop into flame. So one thing we can do, and this is just what I've been thinking about recently, is to put a couple of barriers inside the roof to break it up, to try and contain the fire into one small part of the roof cavity, and that way it might give the residents a longer period of time when they can take refuge in that house before they have to evacuate. So the roof cavity is a big one because, unfortunately, the whole area of the house, every room in it, is susceptible when the roof cavity goes up. And that also happens with the understory area. So this is the area where, your child goes to university and they say, Dad, Mum, where can I put my furniture because I'm moving into residential college? And you say, well, we'll just put it under the house. And of course, that's not a good idea because it's combustible material underneath the house and it's very susceptible to amber attack. Remember, for 2 hours, embers are going to be assaulting this structure. So you can put up these screens. All of this is in the Australian standard. The screens would be made of steel, bronze, or possibly aluminium, depending on the bushfire attack level, and the gaps would be no more than 2 millimetres. So putting screens at the lower level is a really good idea and very necessary. Glazing. Glazing is a big one. I talked earlier about the fact that high wind speeds will really impact upon a large expanse of glass, but so does radiant heat. So radiant heat will cause the glass to crack, and then the high wind speeds will push it in. Sometimes the glass will explode because of both of those combined factors. These images here were taken of a structure that survived the 2009 fires. It wasn't the bushfire itself that got this. There was vegetation nearby, very dense vegetation which caught alight, and the radiant heat from that caused the glass to crack. So where you have thick vegetation next to the house, and Corey's mentioned this, and Sue will mention this later, it's really important and it's not something you want to do. Re-entrant corners. So what happens is you've got high wind speeds and they will push these small embers collectively into an area. And here you can see where they've been extinguished, but they would have, if those ember piles in the corners hadn't been extinguished, they would have flared up and that door would have gone. So re-entrant corners are really important. We need to look at structures which have a simple design and don't have re-entrant corners. So it's not just the house, it's the area around it. So timber fencing and timber retaining walls are also building ignition points. What happens with this, an older paling fence is it catches a light and it takes a fire right up to the house. And you can see here, well, we've got retaining walls. What happens with those is they catch a light as well, and depending on how close they are to the house, they can impact on it as well. I've been looking at some of the building, which is the rebuilding which has been happening in Paradise in California from their fires from 2018, and the first houses have been done, and obviously the cost is more. And I read about one family who said, yeah, we'd built the house to code, but we've got a dog, and so we had to put a fence up pretty quickly, so we've got a wooden fence all the way around to make sure the dog doesn't get out. And so they've actually endangered their house by having that timber fence. So cost is just so important. And the landscaping is so important too. So we use a non-combustible fence. You can also get slimline fences that you can put that store water, and that can be used potentially as bushfire defence as well. Vents and weep holes. We need to put that steel mesh behind those as well. This is taken from another 2009 house that was lost. And you can see how the area around the vent here has been burnt, and embers would have got in there too. I think it's really important to have a non-combustible area around the house. So the idea of now having garden beds next to the house has gone. We don't do that anymore. And we try to have a non-combustible area so that when embers do collect around our house, they're not going to cause the house to go up. And what they've done here, for example, is to use pot plants, which are small. They're not high dense. They're not dense plants. It might just be perennials Yeah, so the other good thing about having this non-combustible area is that when you want to clear out your gutters, you can put the ladder onto a solid surface. Avoid lightweight second-story extensions. Just avoid them, because unfortunately they're very susceptible to flame. And they often have large amounts of glazing, which is also, to capture the views, but it does put the house at risk. Corey mentioned earlier about building-to-building ignition. This is a real issue. Unfortunately, what we do is we all want to get that ocean view or those vistas, and so it's at the bottom part of our block that will allow us to do that. So everybody builds down there, and when one house goes up, it will impact on the others. And this was Tathra. So we're doing more research about the effect of building-to-building ignition and how we can possibly resite our buildings to minimise the effect of that. One thing we have to do is change our client perceptions. Now, you'll be dealing with clients who are stressed, but it's important to say we need to start to think differently about how we rebuild in bushfire-prone areas. So rather than focused on the views and the vistas, what you might have to do is say the view and the vista is there. You just have to walk out the door, walk for maybe 5 metres, okay? So you've got a big task to get them to change their mindset on that. We have become lazy. We want massive amounts of glazing. We want everything at our footsteps. We just want to walk out of our bed in the morning and see this glorious vista. But it comes at a cost in bushfire-prone areas. And that cost can be death. It can be life. So you build close to the earth, close to the ground, and you use the slope of the land to your advantage. This is a really interesting image. It's almost textbook perfect because it shows, there isn't much vegetation there. That's not likely what you're going to find in bushfire-prone areas, but you get the idea of what I'm saying. This is probably more the future of what we're going to go for, and it's going to be a bit of a hard sell because people want double stories. But we have become a bit greedy in terms of what we want. So if you're going to reduce cost, you're also probably going to reduce the size of the structure that you build. So how do we reduce the cost and create more internal space? This is an area where you will really excel, because so far the research has been done on construction materials. It hasn't looked at design. This is where you as architects will really shine, and this is where we need you to step up. These are just some very basic examples. So you're likely to have a smaller floor plan because things are going to cost more. So now we have to make better use of that floor plan, and we do that through good design. We will use built-ins far more than we have before, because they create internal space. We will use less glazing. We'll still have windows, but you might have to go on site and get a step ladder and step up and say, the best vista I can get is 2 metres up, and it's looking at that valley over there, and I'm going to design that window into my structure. So it's windows to capture vistas, to create, to draw your eye out of the smaller space to create that illusion of a larger internal space. You've got a simple design feature here, which is to not have a separate laundry, but to have it integrated into the kitchen. We've become obsessed with black framed windows in this country, and we need to let that go in this one, because unfortunately what black frame does is it stops that transition from inside to outside. I'm sure you all know this, but just in case you don't. So your eye looks at the window, it sees the frame, it pauses, and then it goes through. So if you've got a light-coloured frame, your eye is drawn straight outside. It's that beautiful, lovely transition, and that's what we will use to create the illusion of more space when we've got less space. And we'll do the same when you've got glazing and you're looking at a paved area, because we really like paved areas now. We don't want decking, we want paved areas, non-combustible surfaces. So rather than having the tiles horizontal, you'll have them vertical to draw the eye out. So they're just some of the things that you can do. Now, this is really important. It's really important. As a design creative person, I understand, we all understand that you are totally involved and you love what you've come up with and the design solution is great. But getting across the development application line can be difficult. You're learning now that there's lots of codes that you have to adhere to, and those codes have come about through 70 years of research. I would think that there will be much more flexibility now in terms of design, but it's important to start to say things like, we want to work cooperatively, not, do you know who I am? This is my design masterpiece. So we've got to let that part of our egos settle down a little. We can think it, but we have to be a bit more moderate in what we say. Because in the past, fire agencies have had to deal with this, and often fire agencies deal with the development applications at the really high end, at BAL-40, BAL flame zone, and this becomes a bit overwhelming. So we've got to meet in the middle. So I'm going to suggest that we will say things like this, that as an architect, planner, or landscape architect, I or we want to work with legislators and fire authorities to improve the performance of buildings in bushfire-prone areas, because we really need to work collectively on this. That's my last slide. This is just, a guide. It can't be applied to everything. And once again, I say at the bottom here that you always act on the bushfire warnings, and you will tell this to your clients. You always act on the bushfire warnings of the local fire authorities, because they don't give those warnings lightly. So that's my talk.
Thanks, Douglas. No stranger to a bit of controversy there. And you're going to see it in the next little session. What we have is 6 architects to step up and show their work, or discuss the work of architects. And they range from young to old. And we thought we'd put one of the more interesting ones on first. A young chap called Rory Betts-McRae. Where are you, Rory? Where have you gone? Thank you. Rory's a master's student from the Architecture School at the University of Newcastle. And his family commissioned a house that was designed by Fergus Scott, as I understand it, in a flame zone situation. So Rory's going to talk a little bit. It's probably his first public talk as an architect. Treat him kindly.
So I'd first like to start by saying, or recognising that this land is of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So just after 3 p.m. on Thursday the 5th of December, our next door neighbour called. We could hear the fear in her voice. The Curragh fire, which had encircled our villages of Bawley Point and Kiola, had just crossed and cut off the road access in and out for several days, had just jumped Lake Willinga and was heading towards our properties. It was reported that the flames were 30 metres high and we were in the direct line of the fire. 8 minutes later, this is what arrived. The footage was shot from the side of our neighbours' homes. The flames you can see across the screen and behind the house are all on our property. There's the fire. So, Fergus Scott Architects were commissioned to design our home in 2007. The home was completed in 2009. The site is 5 acres of bushland within 1 kilometre of the beach, set on a hill, with panoramic views of the Southern Ocean, Brush Island, Pigeon House Mountain and surrounding national parks. In response to the exposed hilltop of the coastal site, Fergus designed a building comprising of 2 pavilions with a central sand garden and a pool terrace within the building footprint. There was a focus on framing the views through the windows and openings of interrupted panorama to connect us with the natural landscape. The design placed the building on the lee side of the hilltop, following the contours of the site. Fergus often referred to the spine of the building as the protective western wall, a considered response to coastal elements, anticipating southerlies and norwesterly winds, with the potential for bushfires as one of the considerations. You can see the bush that surrounded our site, with our house located just there. And I would ask everyone to please recognise this wall for later in the presentation. We imported an African safari tent to stay on the property during the design and construction stage, and which remained as guest accommodation. This was a few hours prior to the evacuation. When this photo was taken, a few hours prior to evacuating, the Curragh fire had burnt 7,000 hectares of bushland. Just a couple of weeks ago, when it was finally declared out, it had claimed 499,645 hectares. On the afternoon of the 5th of December, a friend told us the fire impacting Bawley was live on Twitter. We immediately recognised the vision on the screen was our place.
Is running all around town trying to contain spot fires, which are really being fed by these really powerful winds. They're pushing the fire towards the coast and basically through the heart of Bawley Point.
That's our roof. The lead fire finger raged directly from the west, with two fire fingers racing up the hill from the northwest. They merged directly behind our place, with the full fire front following. The footage and images show the fire engulfing the properties from all sides. Anyone who witnessed it declared the house was gone. The news reporters describes the house on the hill as either gutted or lost. Both words aptly describe how we felt on the day. So, if everyone remembers that wall with the opening that I showed you, that's that. Just for a bit of scale. We were later told we were lucky that we burnt early in December, as we had resources available then. On New Year's Eve and the following Saturday, many townships didn't. I was personally down on the coast during this time, and we heard multiple stories of people calling 000, asking for emergency help, to which there was a response, there's no one coming, everyone's out. There were simply too many fires to fight. As nothing happened, no trucks were on our property, the fire was too ferocious. 2 helicopters relentlessly water-bombed ours and neighbouring properties as water was taken directly from the ocean. When we returned by boat, our land was unrecognisable. Our luxury tent was gone, yet the house was still standing, smouldering but proud. The fire had burnt right up to the steel wall on the ocean side. Baz, our next door neighbour, had been home recovering from a hip replacement he'd had a week earlier. He left his son to continue putting out spot fires around the house, to trek up rough and still burning ground to put out 2 fires that had taken hold under the steel wall of the living room with burnt hoses. His selfless act saved our home. To provide context of the bushland of the township, on the western wall boundary, these house placements set back to provide several asset protection zones. The radiant heat, which runs along the fire, held back by the wall. So I'll just point out, this is our house here, and you can see all the bushland that our house backs onto, as well as the main townships of Bawley Point. This is the radiant heat wall that was required by the DA for any construction to be built on our land, and which we later found out saved not only our house, but also the surrounding towns. To explain how the flame hit, fueled by the radiant heat, combusting to 50-metre flames and fireballs pushing up along the wall, slowly the fire pushing it back onto itself. The intensity of the fire is shown by the apocalyptic scene behind the radiant wall. So what you can see there is the fire when it first hit at the back of our land, and the radiant heat reflected back off against the radiant heat wall directly behind our house. And that pushes the heat up, and so that flames went from 30 metres to 60 metres high. This is what was left. Paul Del Mar, a highly respected fire consultant, attended a site after the fires and expressed in his expert opinion, the wall and the house in its design, placement and materials saves the house, and he believes dozens of homes in Bawley Point. Another fire inspector with 30 years of firefighting experience asked to see the house that had been reported lost. Having seen the footage, he couldn't believe that it had survived. As he circled the house in response to another saying, "It's a bloody miracle," he said no. What he was seeing was a design outcome, adding how whoever designs this place, he wanted to meet and shake their hand. So you can see in the landscaping, what we did was expose the rock that was surrounding our site due to a very minimal topsoil found within the site. And what that did was create a fire break, which helped stop the fire from... So that's actually the radiant heat wall there that you could see in the previous photos. We couldn't see it at all. It was completely encircled by bush before the fires. But all this rockscaping between us and the wall meant that the fire couldn't carry directly through to our house. So it slowed the fire down, and it had to encircle a lot of land to get to the front of our house. I would like to thank Fergus, as well as our neighbour Baz, and our local fireys, who battled every day of the fire for 76 days of the Kaurong fire. To Mother Nature for her resilience, and we learnt that you can measure the heat of fire by the height at which the regrowth appears. This tree was 2 metres from the house and is growing out of the roots. Thank you.
Good luck in the Masters, Rory. You can have a Masters for me in public speaking, and also an incredible explanation of a very beautiful house. Now, the notes say we go from the sublime to the corblimey. Oh. Apparently it's me up next, David. People may know that my practice in Verona Studio deals in what the Americans call poor architecture. We actually do affordable and sustainable housing, and our housing designs are mostly for project homes and what we call concept homes, which is a small business that does very, very small, cost-effective homes. It is a way in which we can satisfy our desire to find a house that's somewhere between a project home and an architect-designed home. Now, I was asked by the drum on the ABC to explain the principles of design for bushfire. So these are some outtakes from this thing, which I believe is going to be broadcast sometime next month, probably when the bushfires come back. So we just took what we said could be a standard 3-bedroom house. It's actually pinched from a manual of standard house designs from the National Capital Development Commission in Canberra. And with 3 bedrooms, a bathroom and a laundry, and a deck and a sort of a welcome porch and a deck. And the way in which that would normally be finished would be with a roof like this. This is traditional pitched frame roof construction. The problem is, in a bushfire, all the valleys, as well as the ridges, but particularly valleys, are weak points for ignition, as Douglas explained, and they are places where leaves collect, and it also makes it difficult to clean the roof and do the maintenance that's been talked about. I should also explain that the idea in this is a single-storey house, and for reasons of demonstration, the black bit underneath it suggested that it could be built up off the ground, but it would be better if it was a slab on the ground. So we talked about that roof, and then we suggested in this video piece that maybe a simpler roof which drained down to gutters just on two sides rather than being all the way around would be easier to maintain, easier to have leaf guard, and of course less crevices in which embers could attack or embers that would set fire to leaves. We were architects, so we actually put a rolled roof, a curved corrugated top to it. I was a student of Glenn Murcutt's after all. So we then looked at what would happen if the roof had sprinklers on the ridge and all the way around the edges to it, and we explained the methodology of wetting the building, wetting the roof and wetting the areas where ember attack can most likely come in, underneath the eaves, at the eaves and through windows, and of course underneath the floor, which gets enclosed. We then looked at the notion of having that water tank, might be, since the code, and we'll talk about this after the afternoon break, is about 1,000 litres a minute, and you need at least an hour's worth. You might need a 60-litre tank, which is what we kind of modelled there, and you'd need that water also to go to a pump and a gun. Believe it or not, Lego, my great friend Lego, actually have a water pump to put in the model, as well as a good dog. Then the next thing we looked at was, would you have a bushfire shelter? Once you've protected the building, and you'll notice that what's happened to the building now is that there's now a gauze-in area around the open deck, so that at times when the bushfires are not there, we can actually trickle water down that gauze. Could be bronze, steel, aluminium, if it's not in the flame zone. And that actually turns the house into a kind of Coolgardie safe. As the breeze goes through it, you get a cooling breeze, as well as it, of course, being a defence against ember attack. And the windows, which you can see in that version of it, have shutters above them. And here you see the owners of the house. I know they have names in Lego, but I can't remember them. And the people and their favourite pets and any animals then go into the fire shelter and shut the door and they're safe. And as was said earlier on, it's 15 to 20 minutes is the time scale of the intense fire front coming across and the radiant heat and so on, as Douglas talked about. And once that's happened, you can exit and go back to putting out spot fires and putting out the embers. So they were our principles. What does it look like? In reality, this is a low-cost home, since this was for a couple in their first home on a piece of land that their family had owned, but it never developed because it's right at the edge of the bushland in North Epping. It's a house design that we cost at $250,000 construction cost, but cost $340,000 with all the flame zone and add-ons, as well as some additional things that the clients wanted, a much larger deck area to it. Essentially, it was intended, as part of our research into trying to make buildings cheaper, as two modules built as portable modules made in prefab, which is one of my passions. However, it's still not possible to get prefab homes built at a cost point where they are the high quality that you can get out of prefab, but also be the lower cost. Hence, the roof forms of them are designed to be able to get underneath bridges and so on from remote locations. This, had it gone ahead, would have been made by a firm called Modulan, which is based in Brisbane. However, it was custom made with some things such as the sliding shutters over the windows that were exposed, made from a compressed fibro cement sheet hung on rollers inside an aluminium frame, which then rolls out over the window. There are screens over some of the windows which are not directly in the flame zone, that have crim safe, a material that you'll be familiar with, or on the left-hand side there you'll see shutters which roll down over the windows. The house itself is entered on the left-hand side, these photographs are taken just before occupation, so the landscaping, which was done by the owners, is not finished. And they walk inside, and then you can see out onto that deck, and there's a pool of water that's meant to be sitting in there between the two, and then out into the terrace area at the back. The internal parts of it were made from timber, plywood, one of my favourite pieces of it, in accordance with what you had just said. So that, if you like, is a way of building what is a very, very beautiful piece of land, but highly under threat, trying to apply those principles to get a flame zone house constructed. Thank you. Now, our next speaker is Nigel, and Nigel is one of a contingent coming from the Blue Mountains, with a lot of work in the Blue Mountains. Nigel's also going to talk later on in the third session, and that's when I'll give him his full and due presentation of his complete CV. But for now, could you invite, please, with acclamation, Nigel to the stage.
Thank you, Tone. I'm going to talk about that project, most particularly because that's the one that's featured on the front of the environment note that's been offered free by the Institute. And it's one of my projects that has a story, not just the straightforward part of being flame zone. I was commissioned 2012 by the owners of this standard timber pole frame house to fill in down below. Single story to the street. In fact, the street level was about the top of the ridge. It was a steeply sloping block to the southwest. Single story towards the street after you go down many steps or a very steep driveway. And on the bottom left is the two-story with probably 15 metres of grass and a swimming pool before you hit the steep land and bushland. Underneath, entirely open and exposed, and you can see the addition they did. This was built in the early mid-90s, how 5 years later they added an office wrapped in western red cedar, the most flammable of all timbers. So I was called in 2012. Their kids were coming up to teenage years. They wanted to fill in down below so they could actually gain extra space. This was a couple, probably 30s, early 30s, their first home. What was cheapest on the market? Well, a very difficult block of land. Oh, and a cheap project home of the time. It had everything wrong. And this is where the fires started in 2013, Springwood, on the edge of the golf course. And it was proven to be the tree up against too close to power lines that was to come down, but hadn't actually come down on that extreme fire risk day. The wires touched the foliage and the fire ran. And of course, typical for my neighbourhood, Blue Mountains, at northwest to southwest, it runs across. But look at the town planning of 30 years ago. Look at these houses impossibly strung out along the ridges. Every possible bit of half-flat land was built upon. It should never have been approved. And that's the problem. The legacy problem, certainly in my town, my area, and many parts of Australia, what has been approved 20 or 30 or 40 years ago is really, in many cases, undefendable if a fire comes through. And that's what proved here. The particular property, well, going back. The particular property is there. Southwest, fire comes across, takes out a good number of these, takes out half of that street, takes out most of these, takes out more over there. 2013 Springwood Windmilly fire. There would have been many deaths because there's only one road in and out as it heads towards what's called Yellow Rock. There was about 60 or 70 people milling at the end of the dead end of that road as the fire was coming down towards them. They panicked, didn't know what to do. Luckily, there was one RFS tanker crew that said, this way, 500 metres up the road, there is a house we can defend. So 60 or 70 people with dogs, apparently a horse or two, animals, crowded into that house and they were saved. Again, luck and the fortune of having fire authority people there purely by chance and happy coincidence. But that could have been 60 or 70 people on that one occasion if that hadn't been the case. Obviously, the house we're talking about burnt down. It had everything wrong. But the interesting part and the difficult part of the story is the fact that I kind of knew this beforehand because I'd done work, wrote environment design guides 2003, 2004. And I knew what could happen. The client listened. They doubled the budget. But we could not make an existing house to meet 100% of the fire regulations with the best will of the world and as much money. It was pole frame. We were going to cover every bit of timber. We were changing the roof line to make sure it's more aerodynamic and wouldn't catch the burning embers. We replaced the deck with everything non-combustible. We insulated and then reclad in metal, corrugated metal, cheap and effective. But we couldn't get approval. 9 months working through our local government, then working through RFS headquarters, no approval, because we couldn't get 100% compliance. So the question came down to, would you knock down $500,000 worth of house to put up $1 million worth of brick? How much safer would you be? 2%? 5%? It wasn't going to happen. The project didn't occur. And so within a year, that's what happened. So, in terms of rebuilding, these people took their time. I spent a lot of time in Marysville, 2009. That's its own story. The people who build quickly are not going to be your clients or my clients. They're the people that are really trying to deal with their emotional trauma and difficulty and want to replace what they had as closely as to what it was immediately. Fill a hole in their heart and their psyche. People that take time are going to become potentially your clients and mine. They're going to be more thoughtful. They're going to be more demanding. Yes, they too have to work through trauma and difficulty, but they're thoughtful and they want knowledge, they want expertise. These people took 4 years. And of course, they had many fights about insurance. I'll mention that later. In rebuilding, tricky, because here is the block north to the top. So the original house was the rectangle on north-south, basically to fit in all between the contours and the very steep land. To rebuild, okay, the best we could do was face northeast. You couldn't get around to true north. And of course, next door had a house right there. So again, this house is set low. How can we screen off that basically to their north? Now, in reality, they haven't rebuilt next door there, and they haven't rebuilt next door here. Half those blocks of land after 2013 fires are still vacant. So here we kept the driveway. That remained. What a surprise. The swimming pool remained. So it was how to get a house in there. So we put forward the design, and it became a thicker house because we were trying to get sun and ventilation in back rooms, as we all do as architects. But the problem became that, again, of regulations. The cross-section shows part of the ground line. The street goes right up. The street is right up high. So it was a concrete slab. Everything down below was working off the old driveway. Everything down below is concrete block, only minimal windows with Corten shutters. And otherwise, everything was up here, which I designed as single story within the courtyard terrace because they're well above natural ground. A late addition was to add a study up in the roof. That was here. Designed deliberately to try and not be a blockage or a dam for both embers and for severe bushfire events. Problem was, here we've got a Velux, a Velux, and a Velux. I nearly always put them in. I believe in natural light ventilation in back rooms. Why, in the brightest, sunniest country in the world, with one of the most temperate climates, aren't we using that as an everyday norm? But BAL-40, yes. Rebuilding, flame zone. A year of discussion, argument, backward and forwards, technical research. No, you can't do it. They wouldn't refuse it, but they wouldn't approve it. In a year. No precedent. My client is well known, didn't want to take it to court. Unfortunately, it'll take something like a court case to be able to sometimes wedge or lever change. Under construction of the rebuild, it was, pretty standard standard timber frame. Anything going through obviously had to be metal. Everything had to be sealed, no gaps more than 2 millimetres. And of course you can see from the driveway, that original driveway, and then that became the garage. And then we've got the house proper, which is relatively elevated purely because the land falls so quickly. The cladding on the outside became magnesium oxide board, and that was added. Because we used timbercrete, which had been tested to 190 millimetre thick, as having an FRL, 240, 240, 240. 4 hours fire protection, not good enough in a 70 mil when it's compounded in with expanded polystyrene on the inside. Not accepted because the thinner version had not been individually fire tested. Not acceptable. So we ended up, another 20 grand, having to use what meets the fire test and then overclad it at additional cost. So you can see we used these timbercrete panels over the fire resistant. We've got everything below is blockwork, concrete and the like. Core 10 used on various walls, and where you have awkward windows that you can't put shutters on, we actually have a Core 10 swing shutter that, of course, it faces the neighbour, so it's not really the most fire prone, but we hope would be closed at the right time. Otherwise, the great frustration was we're not allowed to put in Veluxes. So I said, okay, test it to BAL-40. We went through the numbers, the number crunching. No, won't accept it. Okay, what about Velux with using CrimSafe over the top? That reduces radiant heat 47%. No, won't accept it. Oh, well, you'll accept windows in a wall with an aluminium shutter. This is 4 or 5 years ago. We'll do that above this. No, we won't accept it. Without a court case, what do? Or you hope logic carries through. So the house is now built. It's got those flipped up with only short triple-sized box gutters, and maybe one day it might magically appear. But in the meantime, we had to do stupid things like put that in directly facing the radiant heat in the fire front. Silly. One other little point here is, look at that. When we're dealing for FZ or BAL-40, you have to look at every detail. You'll hear more about that later. But you can't have things like the extractor fan grill going through a wall. You certainly can't be plastic, 2 millimetres or less opening. You don't want that covered with fat and grease. There are many little tricks to what you can and can't do. Inside's very pleasant. Obviously, it's got good natural light now coming from above. That becomes the office way up. It was to be a relatively modest house because, like most people, when they came to rebuilding, it was going to cost hundreds of thousands more than where they started from, and they too were underinsured. We can talk more about that later. Anyway, in the end, they lost, as people do in bushfires, everything. They had a fantastic art collection of Aboriginal art and all sorts of things. They have all the family memorabilia. They even asked me for photographs of the original house. They had nothing. So that everyone has to start again. But that's where you and I will be listening in to that future AIA presentation in, a month's time about rebuilding after bushfires. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Now we're going to hear from Jamie Brennan. He's an architect. He's a partner of 6B Design, and he's lived and worked in the Blue Mountains. It's very much a Blue Mountains afternoon, you'll see. He specialises in sustainable and bushfire architecture. Jamie, welcome.
Hello. I live and work in Katoomba. I've chosen to look at a non-residential project today because the Australian Standard looks at residential projects but the RFS also cover non-residential projects. So they call them special. Oh.
That was special.
Yeah. Do I do that? Yeah. Special fire protection purposes. And I also wanted to just cover a little bit briefly what conflicts you have between non-residential and bushfire controls. So the RFS, New South Wales RFS have a document called Planning for Bushfire Protection on their website, 2006, which is currently being updated. They look at special fire protection purposes as well as many other aspects. And these types of projects, commercial types of projects, tend to have occupants that are more vulnerable to bushfire attack or bushfires, because there's lots of people there, they're old, they're young, they're sick. Schools, hospitals, nursing homes, tourist accommodation covered by the RFS. So the objective of these projects are to have more reliance on asset protection zones, so you have bigger setbacks to the bush, and emergency management, which the school that I'm going to look at, that has an emergency or a bushfire policy. So if the weather is above extreme, then the kids can't come to school. The idea is to is not to use the emergency services resources to protect large numbers of people. If you can get them out of the site, then the emergency services can protect the assets and not have to put all their resources at a school, for example, as long as they know they're safe. This school doesn't meet the requirements, the setback requirements, so it has increased construction controls. This is just a part of a plan. One of the conflicts with schools is you need, the school has to be accessible, and that means the accessible path of travel can only have a level change of 5 mil. But a bushfire door needs a seal that's more like 30 mil, so you can close the door and stop embers coming in, and it closes against the seals. So you have to come up with a solution that meets almost every individual door. In this example, option 1 shows the doors that are more exposed to the bushfire, so they're bushfire doors that meet the standards. Option 2, so with a commercial building or school, you need 2 fire exits from each room or each level. So you can start to look at different doors for different purposes. So option 2 is an accessible door but doesn't fully meet bushfire controls. And we located them in a recess in the building away from the bushfire threat. On this site, the bushfire threat was just coming from one side of the site. So you can orientate some doors away from that threat. But it doesn't comply with either code, either the BCA or bushfire. So this is the 2 examples. The top one shows a bushfire door that has the seal and the door closes to it. There's a door ramp on the inside. This was a renovation to an existing room, so we had all kinds of other issues. Option 2 shows an accessible door that doesn't comply with bushfire. It complies in every way with sills around the sides, the top. It's just the bottom sill that doesn't comply. The glass complies, the frame complies. So I just want to quickly go over the flame zone construction for this project. The top extract shows, well, that's from the Australian standard. Basically, you can use 90mm masonry for flame zone, or a system that has a FRL of 30-30-30. The bottom extract is a CSR standard 30-30-30 FRL construction using a standard stud wall, 16mm fibrous cement, fire check, sarking, a batten, and then cladding. So you can use standard construction for flame zone. There's many other manufacturers who have similar construction. This is a lime rendered wall over a straw wall at the school. So we used a 90mm render over that straw, lime render. At the bottom of the wall, there's a 90mm angle, and around the window, there's a 90mm angle. The main reason to do that is so that we could show that it complied during construction and sign it off at the end, because 90mm renders fairly thick. And also it gives you a place to attach bushfire shutters to, because the lime render's soft and not structural. And this is a recent extension that's just been completed. This uses more conventional materials, recycled bricks, more than 90mm thick, 110 thick, and cladding over stud walls with fire check, battens and metal cladding. The FRL standards mention you can have any cladding, but the RFS says the cladding can't be combustible. So some people put a timber cladding on it and doesn't comply with the RFS. And you can see on this window as well, there's the window surrounds built out as well to hide bushfire shutters as well. So I just wanted to touch on a few commercial building conflicts with bushfire control. But for an existing building, there's many conflicts, and the RFS planning for bushfire protection sets out the objectives which help you to work through those conflicts and come up with a solution with the PCA. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Delightful to have something outside the residential scale. Thank you for that. Next speaker is Ingrid Donald. She works in Blackheath, still in the Blue Mountains. And the notes say what I would interpret as triple bottom line architecture. I think it's the coming thing in this century, in the 21st century, that people now look at not just the cost-effective way of doing things, but in her words, her architecture is imbued with a genuine interest in the people who occupy it and the surrounding environment. I think that's incredibly important. Please welcome Ingrid.
Thank you. I took my the emphasis for this talk on the word extreme, because we're building in extreme environments. The house I'm going to look at is located here. The town of Blackheath is here. It's a 6 kilometre road, and it's one road in, one road out. Okay. But for me, the centre of this design is the people, and the people who occupy this house are extreme sports people, and they need an extreme house for their extreme environment. The other aspect to this project is that it was an owner-builder for a BAL-FZ house, which is an interesting undertaking by itself, but he'd already built a boat and he'd already built a canoe, so he was sure he could build a flame zone house. This is their existing house, or was their existing house. It was quite an extreme existence. They decided to rebuild once they could feel the rain coming in through the cracks in the glass in the windows. It's also an extremely isolated property. Hang on, how to go back. This is the house here. There is a large cleared area, which is pretty much the boundaries of the property, go to the road here, up the side here, and to the back of a natural water pool. There's an existing garage, which actually occupies just a climbing wall. And there's a 100,000 litre tank here, and we built a 20,000 litre water tank here, as well as a natural water pool, and that's to provide enough water in the event of a bushfire event coming, because there is no town water here, and there probably won't be a truck turn up. The other important thing is that the access is a direct line of sight from the driveway, so it's very clear if a truck was to come, where it goes, where the water tanks are. The house is also basically a rectangular shape, so that in the event of a fire, people can navigate around the house without having to go through complex geometries in and out of corners to get around to put out those embers. And the other notable thing is that there's very much a clear landscape around the house. In terms of flame zone materials, I just thought I'd point out, because it was an owner-builder, it had to be quite a simple construction. So what we did was we used two main products. One is this Promatech board, which basically fire rates the same as the 16mm fire check. The other product is this sort of cement sheet looking product here and here, which is a 16mm board called Inex board, and it's rated to flame zone. The client wanted a variety of roof forms, they wanted a variety of materials. So again, it's not about building a bunker in the ground. This is these people's homes, so I wanted to design something that was reflective of what they wanted but still complied with all the bushfire regulations. The other thing to note that in the standard there is a detail for eaves design which shows a double batten with fire resistant insulation, and that's what this extra insulation along the edge of the roof is. There's also brickwork, which you'll see in the next slide. This house also has extreme colour. The client was, well, the wife was imagining a burnt orange, nice subtle sort of orange, and the husband went to the store and came back with safety orange, and it's stuck. Again, simple gable roof forms, double story to capture the view, even though I know a few people have said not to do that today. What else can I say? Brickwork. Again, there is a few in and outs, but it's basically a rectangle in plan. This house was approved prior to the changes in the window Australian standards at the end of 2017. So it's a combination of BAL-40 windows with aluminium shutters over, using the light coloured windows so that you capture the views. It was a requirement for the client. Her study is here, and she wanted to be able to see people coming up the driveway through that window. I don't know what else to say. The other thing is it's also extreme climate because there's also snow in the area. So building for both bushfire and snow climate is quite a challenge. And I just wanted to finish with a bit of extreme sport. I don't know how to make it work. Thank you.
That's great, Ingrid. I think you've beautifully interpreted the rather simple things that I was putting into my Lego model. Because the finest ideas you have at Lego always get compromised when they meet humans. And please take this the right way, but one of my favourite sayings is that every great battle plan fails on meeting the enemy. So it is with design. Our last speaker in this group is Peter Buckwell. Now, I mentioned earlier on we're going from the young, come on up, Peter, from the young to the old. I was referring to myself. Peter's not old. He's experienced, is what Peter is. He's got lots of things. His experience in Mount Victoria and so on. He's been, I think, president of the country division. He's been an architect for a lot longer than most of us. And he's also been a very generous contributor to the Institute. Thank you, Peter.
This is newfangled. You press that to go, do you? No?
Got your eye out with a green light.
Right. Just give me a minute and I'll be sorted. Okay. Well, good day everybody. Grandview House is the name of the original house. So, a little bit of history. Yeah. There's the house on the landscape. This is an escarpment here. It's at Mount Victoria. And at that point, I think that's right, is it, Nigel? That's where the house is. And when I found this block of land, there wasn't another house in all that area. It was total wilderness. And I decided to build myself a house. This was in 1971, after I purchased the land. And it was completed in 1979 because I built it on weekends myself, and that was the house I lived in. But in 1985, or thereabouts, I built a studio. A studio is further up the block and much more accessible. It was actually a garage, not really a studio to be honest, but a garage. And change this. There it is. And the garage was later converted into a studio and later into a studio dwelling, if you could put it that way. The garage is ostensibly made from steel. I was very, very conscious to make it bushfire resistant. Without knowing anything about the BAL system, without knowing anything about how you go about doing it in a formal way, in a technical way, I designed a building which I thought would be resistant to bushfires. And it was upgraded a little bit when I made it into a dwelling, but it is ostensibly a steel building. It's steel construction all the way through. And it's a steel frame building. It has purlins and girts, just like a little factory. It has insulation in it, which is incombustible insulation like rock wool. And it's lined with plasterboard now. If I was more conscious of the BAL requirements, I might have done it in something like a 16mm fire check board, but I didn't. But this is it. The important thing is that the building has a sprinkler system on it. Now, I did put a sprinkler system on the original house, and another go at this. That's a bit of the detail of a solar hump. I'll just go forward a bit, and you see that up there is a dam. The dam is on the site, and the dam was put in when I built the original house, and the aim of that was to charge the sprinkler system in the event that the water supply had failed. It was never ever used for that, and when I built the garage and the subsequent studio, I still incorporated the sprinkler system on the roof. Now let me tell you a little bit about sprinkler systems. I told you that I started the house, the original house, in about 1971. Just prior to that, there were some major fires in Victoria. I think they were called the Ash Wednesday fires. I'm not sure of that. But it came to my notice that there were 6 buildings that survived those fires, and those 6 buildings had sprinkler systems on them. And I thought, well, this is for me. I'm going to put a sprinkler system on them. Well, I have to tell you, if you've never experienced it, sprinkler systems are incredibly effective. They, in no less than 15 minutes on a very hot day with little humidity, you put that sprinkler system on and it will deluge the house. The original house has no eaves, and it's designed like a full square so that you can get an even amount of water on all sides of the building, and it provides a curtain of water around the building. I've incorporated that in this building as well. I'll see if I can go back to, how do you turn this back this way? Okay. I don't know whether you can see it, but just there and just there are the sprinklers. They are they're just simple agricultural sprinklers that rotate. They overlap, they have an overlapping arc, and they extend out some 10 metres all around the building. It provides, it changes the whole dynamics of the situation. The humidity rises. Within 15 minutes, it's a different atmosphere altogether. If you had it on for an hour, it's sopping wet. It's surprising. So I can't speak more highly of the idea. I think they work very, very well. And particularly if you design your building so that there's minimal eaves, no gutters, and you have the gutters at ground level, and let me see if I can find one of those pictures. See there's a gutter there at ground level, and across there. The eaves stick out so that you can get proper sun control, and there are also shutters in front of the main glass walls. Those shutters are down for this photograph, but let me see if I can find another shot where, sorry. That's a shot looking out from the shutters. You can see that it looks out onto a yard. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what I think a relatively fireproof building would be. And just before the bushfires came to Mount Victoria and they threatened us, they weren't very far away, I was prepared to stay there. I had additional sprinklers, like garden sprinklers, on some of the bushes nearby, but I was prepared to stay. I felt very confident that I would survive in that building, more so than some other buildings. I just want to make a couple of comments about conventional buildings. Conventional roofs on conventional buildings are a recipe for a disaster, I think, particularly if they're designed with timber framing, particularly if they're tiled roofs. Tiles harbour embers, and it's a great way for a fire to start. The other thing that a lot of people don't realise is you get a lot of dust in a roof, and dust ignites, and that can set off a fire very, very quickly. Also, timber frame construction will, in my view, fail because even if you've got a lot of radiant heat, the heat will actually ignite the timber within the walls if they're not insulated properly. So if you've got steel, I think you've got a better chance of not having ignition, and that's why I've done that sort of construction. The other thing is, just in passing, the glass is double glazed and it's toughened glass. In order to toughen glass, it's got to go through a heat treatment for it to happen, and therefore, by definition, it's capable of withstanding a fair amount of heat. And in fact, it's recommended as a way of mitigating against fires. I think that covers it. It's a little bit erratic in the way I've presented it, but that's how the photographs kind of turned out. Okay, so... okay.
Go back 2 photos. You went through some of those quickly, I think.
2 photos? That's a challenge. Oh,
we didn't get to see it.
that one? Oh, that's in the landscape area. They're gabion walls. I've used them structurally. The roof of the gazebo there is actually insulated panels with metal top and bottom. You know, Kingspan, I think, are one of the ones that come to my mind. It's good to have an insulated roof so that, you know, it doesn't radiate the heat down when you're enjoying yourself. And the gabion walls, of course, are fireproof. Of course, they can harbour embers, but there's nothing there to burn. Okay? Thank you.
Go one back.
One more back. That one?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, yes. It's really important to close off all the gaps as much as possible. That's really to avoid embers. See the gutter at the bottom over here? They're leaves ready to be collected. You can see them.
Just for the sake of the photo.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Peter, don't go too far away. We're going to invite all of the speakers back up onto the stage. If I could get Corey and Douglas, John, and all of the House presenters, Ingrid, Nigel, Jamie. Peter, you come up. There'll be a little bit of question time. I know you want a cup of tea. Thanks, Rory. We have a couple of roving microphones. There's one down here. Mel, where are you? There's a question. Our first question is over here.
Hi, Ben Wallen from Wallen Architecture. We're a contingent of South Coast architects over here. My question, I've documented a number of flame zone homes. Unfortunately, none ever got built. There's all these products that are flame zone, tested, and you can use them. The tricky bit we always found was when you got into the detailing, and you can follow the principles, no gaps. But where you're using one system as a wall, and then that changes to a different system, to the roof, and then you'll have systems that show typical details, and it's a standard 600mm eaves. Your eaves might be 1.2. It's this kind of grey area, and we've looked for consultants that can provide advice on this, and have kind of come up stumps, really. Anyone dare to make a comment on that?
Well, that's a question for the Blue Mountains crew. Nigel, you're the wrangler. Who do you want to start with?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There is no easy answer, and this is part of the problem, that the regulations deal with everything in separate silos. The classic I've used is people who built their dome 20 or 30 years ago. How do you define a wall? How do you define a roof? And everything in between, because the regulations are very specific. There is no one source. In terms of getting generalised advice, you really need to go to a BPAD-trained assessor who will tell you what the BAL rating is, and depending on their...
Who's that? What's that training mean? Come on, no TLAs. Come on, the three-letter acronym.
Okay, those that have done the training course, Western Sydney University, Bushfire, what's it stand for, Corey? Bushfire Planning and Design Practitioner. There are 2 levels. Actually 3 in some cases, and they are people that have paid the money, done the course for specific education and skill about the wide range of bushfire issues. That may or may not extend to construction, and certainly doesn't contact design matters usually. And that's the point. This is where people like Douglas, myself in particular, are trying to build up that field. But yes, one of the other great difficulties is there is no easy way to find out which windows meet BAL-40 or which windows meet Flame Zone and all the other products. We've tried to get the Fire Protection Association and other independent bodies to actually say, it's not that we believe it'll pass, but these are the ones that have done the fire test and have passed. So it's an objective measure, as distinct from what Tone or I might think is probably quite okay. So this is the developing field, and obviously because of the recent fires and seminars like this, the field is going to advance very quickly in the course of this year, as are the regulations.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to add that in regards to materials that you see online or whatever advertised as bushfire flame zone compliant or whatever, I found that you have to actually ring up and interrogate them and ask them what has it actually been tested to, and you'll find that your 600mm can go to 1200mm, and it can sometimes help what you're trying to do if you go straight to the source.
Thanks, Ingrid. Rory.
Also, coming from the South Coast, Andrew Delmar, the fire consultant that we had come after our fire, he was the lead fire consultant employed by Terry Snow, who owns Canberra Airport and built Willinga Park in Bulley Point. And I would highly recommend talking to him, even if he can give advice to someone else, someone local in the area.
Further questions? We've got a couple up through here.
It's Rick Butler is my name. Look, I'm just still puzzled that are we more humans trying to combat nature? And, you know, we're dreaming up these fireproof structures, but are we really going to get there in certain circumstances? And isn't there an idea that maybe you evacuate and it burns? And isn't that a level of advice that another authority could be giving to that particular site? yes, build it, but at some point it'll go.
That's a great question. It's a great philosophical question. Right, everyone, you've all got to have a go at this. Corey.
Yeah, and I think it is a good question. I think from a fire agency's point of view and a policy perspective, we've kind of evolved from the 2009 era where there was this concept of stay and defend. It's very much now not that. It's there's a winner. And I think we've seen it this year. I know in New South Wales concept, a way we dealt with communities was that we would talk about people evacuating and leaving early. So I think there is a need now probably for things like the Australian Standard and the way we deal with building to have a think about the policy perspective from fire agencies and how we manage communities and how we expect them to behave, because that stay and defend process has definitely moved on, and how that then interacts, because like you said, I think if you look at 3959, it is designed that it will withstand the passage of the fire front, but people will need to still be there to put out spot fires and so on. But yet the fire agency's approach now is you probably shouldn't be there. So there is a bit of a mismatch, and probably some of the levers need to get looked at from a broad policy perspective to see if what's being done with communities and how they're managed from a fire perspective is kind of consistent with, I guess, the assumptions that are made at a policy level from a building perspective.
Anybody else want to have a go at that? Do I stay or do I go? Yeah, Douglas.
Look, I agree with what you've said, Corey, but unfortunately sometimes people don't get out. You know, you leave it at the last minute to leave, that gum tree falls in front of your driveway, you can't get your car out. And so as a point of last resort, you may have to take shelter in your home. So I'm completely with you that the best place to be during a bushfire is not where the bushfire is. I agree that you need to leave early, but as a last place of resort, taking shelter in your home as that fire front passes is essential, because if you're out there exposed to that radiant heat, you won't survive.
Yeah, thank you. Look, a couple of hours ago, I think I, scared the living daylights out of everybody with the onslaught of the millennium drought, the fires that come from it. But not all bushfires are like that. So to answer that question, I would say, look, yes, it's important to build a bushfire-prone home, because not all bushfires are going to be like what we've seen most recently. The Blue Mountains, if we're going to take an evacuate policy, we'd be evacuating everybody on the Blue Mountains. I mean, that's simply not possible.
And the problem with that?
Well, I've got to say to you, back in 1994, when I ran the aircraft operation for those bushfires, I had 105 aircraft at my disposal, and I wasted two, I don't mean the word wasted, but I wasted two Sea King helicopters every morning at 6 a.m. They did a run up beside the main highway on either side, 100 metres either side, looking for embers and looking for wayward people. Nobody knew about that. We sent a tanker load of helicopter fuel, 2 tanker loads of helicopter fuel, and parked it in a very safe place up in Katoomba, just so we could run aircraft up there before any fires had occurred up in the Blue Mountains. So whilst the Blue Mountains is a very, very dear place to us all, it's the most bushfire-prone landscape in the world, the fire services plan and activate things that the general public don't know about. So to the question, most definitely build a bushfire-prone house, evacuate at the right time, not all the time.
I think the Blue Mountains, as you say, the most fire-prone and fire-exposed area. But really, I think the question was that it's being developed, and all of that land is owned, and we are a property-owning gerontocracy as a country. So no one's willing to give up and leave there, but it's going to become increasingly more dangerous. How do you balance that out, John?
Well, that said, but don't forget in 1983, when Ash Wednesday fires burnt across South Australia and Victoria, we lost, from my memory, 173 souls and 2,900 homes. If you get the map out, you'll find that Victoria and South Australia don't have as much bushland as what Sydney does. So when the recent fires that came through the northern part of New South Wales, right down to the very south, and the level of losses was so low, you've got to think that somebody in New South Wales is doing something right. I don't want to scare you again, but in Victoria there's been 600 people die from bushfires since 1939. the answer in New South Wales is 60, and that includes firefighters. So New South Wales is doing something very adeptly right. And the gentleman on my right, Corey, was just left the Rural Fire Service, one of those smart people who whilst he was there for many years, there's lots of him like that. And they're helping to make this place a better place and a safer place. And I think we owe the Rural Fire Service a lot. But my concern with the Blue Mountains, as I was talking to Sue Bell at lunchtime, I am worried about the Blue Mountains, not because of the fire proneness of it, but the lack of action that I believe the community up there specifically don't do in relation to protecting themselves as a whole because of what ultimately is green politics. That's another issue. They need to do more. But I would hate to have a situation that just because the east coast of Australia is becoming much more, how would I say?
Dry, I think was the word you used.
If we go from the Great Dividing Range to the coast, the grazing lands that we had there are largely going by the way, and they've been taken over by rural residential or remote people building in there. I think that gradient towards that is increasing. With that brings more need for safety, more need for Rural Fire Service brigades. But I'll just finish, the point of this is that the Rural Fire Service is a community-based organisation who help themselves. Don't ever forget that. In other words, if you go and live in the bush, you join the Rural Fire Service and help yourself. Don't go to the bush and live and not be part of that organisation, even if you just make sandwiches. See it as what it is, a community-based resource.
Well done. And we had another question from the gentleman in the blue shirt up there. Did you still want to? That's good, thank you. If you live near the beach, you join the lifesavers. If you live in the bush, you join the RFS, yeah.
That's right. I had a more specific question for Rory. Thanks very much for your presentation, Rory. I noticed in the house, the Bulley House, Bulley Point House, there was a lot of timber cladding and timber windows. Knowing Fergus Scott, I presume they were hardwood, but they were externally mounted and had sliding screens and battens and things. I was just wondering how they fared in the fire.
Surprisingly well. I was particularly seeing the core 10, so I don't. In the last image of the core 10 that I showed, you could see the extent of the damage caused to that veneer. Blue Scope Steel, who manufactured that steel, we sent the photos to them and asked if there was any lasting or permanent damage if they needed immediate replacing to the panels, and they said that due to the testing they've done, that showed, to get that level of damage, showed temperatures in excess of 550 to 600 degrees Celsius. That is at the edge of the fires and immediately against their house, against the cladding. And that sits right below external timber-clad windows as well. There was not a single scorch mark on any of the timber-clad windows or anything around it. On the western facade, there was no planting, as you could see from the rock landscaping, so no flames could get close enough into there, and certainly with embers, somehow we've put a lot of time and effort and money into oiling and maintaining all that timber as best we can, and they are Australian hardwoods. So I think with the right amount of maintenance and care, but also using it minimally to achieve sort of the effect you want and maintain something aesthetically nice and pleasant to live in, you can still use timber, is given consideration to what type of timber and how you use it in an internal and an external material.
Thanks very much.
Another question? We have one just down here, down the front.
One of the things that was mentioned was the 5 factors, and fuel being the one, the major one. With a lot of the forestation up the east coast being, as I understand, a newer growth, is it more eucalypt-based? Is there any way of maybe modifying the regrowth to less fire susceptible species, or is because we do have what we have. I mean, because I understand a lot of the growth has been forested 200 years ago, and it's come back again as more fire prone. Or is that not true?
John, Corey, I think that's one for you. Isn't it?
Oh, dear oh me, where do we take that one? There'd be a lot of revegetation. The bottom line is the vegetation is fire prone, and our Aboriginal forebears knew how to manage it and did. We've got to take leave from that and use fire more often. But as Corey said this morning, it's very difficult to use fire when you want to use it. It's just becoming a narrow window, and it's very difficult. We can't have, for instance, rural fire brigades everywhere in a burning small box of vegetation, because what it actually does, the more you use fire, the more fire-prone stuff comes back. Blady grass, for instance, is something that is a terrible grass. It's a very thick, coarse grass, and the more you burn that, the more you make blady grass the only thing that comes back. So you've got to be very, very careful. It's a very complex question and not enough time to answer it now.
The last question, I've got one up the back there. We'll do that now. And one over here. And then we'll have a cup of tea. I promise. Another question there. You don't want anyone to have a cup of tea, do you?
Hello there,
Go.
Jill Glebe. Just a quick question, and I just don't know if you've got an answer for it, but the mismanagement of the water cycle, given that we're in such a dry country, both of our rivers and of our own stormwater systems, waste management systems, the entire sewerage system, the way that we manage water in Australia, how much has that contributed, do you think, to the fact that we've just had these huge bushfires and the grounds are really wet, dry?
Corey, where you go?
I'm not an expert in wastewater management or sewage or anything that you asked about. I don't know. I think it's fair to say that water and fire are inherently important. And I know that from a firefighting perspective, water was a huge challenge. There's no doubt. Near the coast, from a bucketing perspective, you've got the ocean. That's usually enough. But when you talk about inland areas, it was a huge challenge for us, particularly in that northwest part of the state. When we started to get down around Tamworth and Tenterfield and those areas, it was really challenging to find water. But to get to your question about, have we mismanaged it? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not too sure. I mean, I'm sure there's better things we can do. I'm sure there's other ways we could better utilise water. But I know from a firefighting perspective, you can never really get enough. And it does become and has been a huge challenge for us. But the answer, I'm not too sure. I don't know if anyone here's got an answer, but I'm sure that's a complex question for a whole set of other people maybe.
Douglas, John, Corey, in your experience in this, isn't that question the question of 2020, that all of a sudden we really realise the confluence of not having enough water? I don't recall in previous bushfires this issue about a major lack of water because we're now using planes and helicopters. Is that a new awakening is all I'm asking?
That's why I thought the question was worth a book. It's a really important question.
Yes, sir.
In my submission to the New South Wales and the federal government, I, like a lot of people, are going to be focusing on airplane support. Most definitely, I believe that the federal government should have 30 aircraft spread around Australia for the type of firefighting that we need, the very minimum, plus a series of helicopters, probably at least 200 around the state, around the country. And the amount of water they're going to need in the future, because I think what Corey and I have said today is sufficient to realise that the future is going to be less about firefighters on the ground, but more about wetting down with aircraft, because it's simply too damn dangerous to put people in front. Now, the photograph that you showed of those 3 firemen holding that hose, I was just amazed when I saw that. I didn't realise it was 3 firemen until the photograph pulled back, and I went, you probably didn't hear me, and I went, oh shit. I really did. I was sort of freaking out when I saw that. So water, our dams, as we all know, everywhere. My dam at home, I was down. I've got 70,000 litres at home, and I had 2 dry dams. I'd been buying water all summer to keep my plants alive. I had enough water for firefighting. I kept it safe, and I had my fire pumps everywhere. But I knew that I was going to run out, and I knew that I couldn't buy it without waiting for a week and a half because everyone was the same. So the whole of where I lived up in the Jurong Valley, we rely on 3 water tanks to, when we're short of water, and I wouldn't have been able to get it unless I ordered it for a week. So I had to be well prepared. So the answer is absolutely yes. It's a big issue, major issue.
I think we had. Oh, sorry.
Also, in my experience over the summer, being down the coast, there's no town water at all, or town sewage, and the fire went through the only road in and out of Bully Point, and so we lost power as well as cell service. So people were left with no emergency comms, no internet reception, no cell service, and no power to run the water pumps for most of their water, as well as burning tanks. People lost water tanks while fighting the fires, and water was rushing down the hill away from the fires, so it didn't even help them in the end. Also, the RFS of the Bully Point and Kiola communities were going around raiding people's tanks to get water to fill their trucks because they couldn't get anything in or out of Bully Point. So making sure you have water before the fire season, everyone's tanks are full, even if it's a holiday home, because it can be used not just by you, but to help save your house, even if you're not there. So water is definitely an important thing to maintain.
Thanks, Rory. I think we had another question over here, and one more. Where was that I saw? Back here. I'm sorry, I'm not going to forget you.
I've got 2 questions. I hope that's okay.
I'll take that as a comment.
One is on the sacrificial house. What about if you have a sacrificial house and a shelter, and that everyone's required to have a shelter but not necessarily required to have a bushfire-proof house? What do you think of shelters? That's the first question. And then the second question is, there's all these bushfire codes. Who's writing them? Are there any architects involved? If not, why not?
I should answer that as I'm the architect. I will be talking more about that specific stuff, in the next session. But in brief, there are 2 fundamentals that have come out of these mega fires from my perspective. Regulators to date will, in most cases, most states, not allow any concession for a sprinkler system, not allow any concession for having a regulation bushfire shelter. It's an extra over and above any regulatory requirement.
But you're going to say that's going to change, Nigel. Don't you think that should change?
I'm doing everything I can to make sure it does change. Yeah. But I'm one of many people. So yeah, I believe it will change. It's the obvious thing, particularly when part of my thesis is that there's 1 million or 2 houses in bushfire-prone areas at the moment with no or almost no protection. What can we do about it? Very little.
The figures that I've read are 1 million houses exposed in fire-prone areas and 1,000 private bushfire shelters. That comes from a website that's promoting them.
Sure.
But which is obviously a very good business model for them.
Sure. But I'll tell more later, but the cost and the physical impossibility of retrofitting many a house will stop it ever meeting AS 3959. We have to look at other lower cost, more effective means of defending. Certainly that could mean, in answer to earlier country, withdrawing, not rebuilding in the middle of the bush. It might mean more clearance around houses, which I don't believe should be happening, but that might be a reality. But these are the sort of things that these commission of inquiries are going to be, no doubt, really gunning for.
It's hard to maintain a tree change if there are no trees. Yeah. I think we had another question back here.
Nigel's actually just started to answer my question.
Apparently, telepathically, you've already answered that question. Is there any more? Oh, there's one up the back there. Come on. Off you go. Run like crazy. And then you can have the coffee.
Hi, I live in Newcastle and we had a horrendous sort of deluge 2 days ago, and there was just water everywhere. And every time it happens, I just think, why can't our cities capture all this water in the right place at the right time and stockpile the water on our coastal cities so that we can provide bigger stockpiles of water for other things. Does anybody have an idea on how that could be legislated or changed or implemented somehow? The water's in the wrong place. That's the only problem. Yeah.
I don't think anyone wants to touch that with a barge pole. Sail's so close to the issue of dams, and I just point you to some of the environmental issues. That there's a proposal to raise Warragamba Dam wall as flood mitigation, and how difficult that might be, because it's so difficult to imagine building new dams. It's not that that's a bad idea. I think it's the Bradfield scheme, as it was called, which was to turn the coastal rivers inland. They've done so many studies on it, and it just doesn't seem to be technically feasible. Okay.
I'll have a go of that one.
All right. Jamie.
At the turn of the century, there's a book called The New Engineer by someone from Wollongong Uni. But basically they said that our sewage system we simulated the poos incorrectly. And the engineers did that on purpose to put in, because of the public health system of the time and the germ theory and everything going on, they simulated our poos in order to get a sewage system over the line. This book's about using science correctly and not lying for political means. So imagine if all our sewage didn't go into the ocean and it went into the ground and it changed our environment. You know, maybe the nutrients going into the soil instead of the ocean would help these environmental issues that we're having. You know, and I think the questions connecting water to fire are correct. We don't have the answers because we're focused on the technology to build a building to protect it from the bushfire. But I think it is the key to the solution that it is a political thing. Water's politics, unfortunately. And I think if people connect that full cycle of life to bushfires, then we'll find solutions.
I'll add to that fire is politics at this point. But I'll bring it to a close. Could you please thank Jamie and Peter, Ingrid, Nigel, Rory, John, Douglas and Corey. Ladies and gentlemen, let's return at 3 o'clock. We have to finish by 4. So we'll make the last session a quick fire round, and we'll look forward to seeing you back here. There's tea and coffee out in the foyer. We'll see you back here at 3 sharpish.